Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Ultimate Medical's second quarterly webinar. I'm Marianne Girardi, the Clinical Education Specialist here at Ultimate Medical. Before we get started, I'm going to do some housekeeping things. We're going to take all questions at the end of the course, so please enter them in the chat. At the end of the course, you will receive an email with a link to the post-course documentation. After completing the questionnaire and evaluation, you will receive your CEUs. In about 24 hours, you will also receive an email tomorrow with the links. So if it does not automatically come after the course, you will be able to complete it tomorrow. You will need to complete them once. So if you have done it prior to getting the email tomorrow, you will not need to do it again. If you have any questions, please email us at education@ultimatemedical.com. Our course today is standing in lying posture our course today is connected standing in lying posture, sitting in lying posture with Tamara Kittleson. Tamara is an occupational therapist and a Resna certified assistive technology practitioner and seating and mobility specialist. She founded Posture 24/7 and Eleanor's Project, promoting 24-hour posture care management and appropriate seating and wheeled mobility provisions in low resource areas. Tamara has presented and written on these topics nationally and internationally. She is the founding chair of the Resna 24/7 Posture Care Management Special Interest Group, a member of AOTA, Resna, Clinicians Task Force, Friends of NERTS, and an ISWP certified wheelchair provider. She served children and adults with complex neurodisabilities in Montana from 1983 to 2022, and credits her daughter Eleanor, who was born with cerebral palsy and profound deafness, as her best teacher. Welcome, Tamara.
Thank you, Marianne, and hello to everybody who is on live here today. Just want to do one more quick little housekeeping details. Shortly before we began, I discovered that my entire PowerPoint, the actual PowerPoint, was available for download in advance of this course. And that was not my intention. It was intended that it be a PDF. So that has been changed now. And I would just like to ask you as a courtesy, if you are one of the people who downloaded my complete PowerPoint, please delete that from your system. I have specific permissions from people whose images are in my slides, and I very much do not want those floating around and available to be used by other people. So again, please just delete the complete presentation if you downloaded that, and go back to that link and you will be able to download it in PDF version so that it's protected. So thank you very much for that little detail. And let's just move on. I always begin by sharing an image of my best teacher, my daughter Eleanor, who's been gone for quite a long time now, but was a user of all of the gear that we will be seeing images of today and talking about. She was born with complex CP and ushered me into the world of family services, where I was on the receiving end instead of on the provider end. So I'm always grateful for the things that she taught me that you just don't learn in therapy school or continuing education courses. So here are our learning objectives. I'm not going to read these. You should have already seen these in the course materials. And we're going to be talking today about just an introduction to 24-hour posture care management. So posture management was defined in a consensus paper that was published in 2006 in Developmental Medicine and Child Neurology. I'm not going to read this definition to you. You can see it in your slides. But I like to bring attention to the fact that this was published, almost 20 years ago, 17 years ago, at a time when really here in the United States, very few of us were talking in these terms. So it has been around for quite a long time, dating back actually to the 1970s when a seminal paper was published in the UK. So why do I talk about lying posture? Basically, it's because most people spend at least 1/3 of their time lying for rest and sleep, especially if we're including sofas and recliners. And this is people who are able-bodied, but many of our folks with motor impairments spend even more time lying for rest and sleep. So if our goal is standing and sitting success, we really must consider what happens when people are not in their standing or in their sitting equipment. So here's just a couple of images I want to bring home, former clients of mine, where what you see in the shower commode chair is what you see posturally lying in bed. You can very clearly see that connection. And again, another client, what you see in his standing frame is what you see when he's lying in his bed. And by the way, it was what you could see in his wheelchair also. So there's a lot of consistency. Now, I'd like you to think for a minute. Do you think it's possible to prevent or correct and even improve altered body shapes through therapeutic positioning? I know that we are all real accustomed to surgeries, various kinds of bracing, but the Montana Postural Care Project suggested that the answer may be yes. This is a pilot study that I ran for 3 years in Montana, 2016 through 2018. I'm working right now on a manuscript hoping to get this published. The model that we used was training for families, caregivers, and professionals all together. We did initial assessments with photos and baseline measures, provided customized lying support materials to all of the people who participated, and then did follow-up visits 5 to 9 months later, depending on which year of the study we're talking about, with follow-up measures as well at that point. It was a broad range of people that we worked with, so not just folks with cerebral palsy, although about 61% of them were, because that's just how it is in the population of folks with impairments and developmental disabilities. But as you can see in this slide, there was an enormous variation across the board of people with different conditions. And some of the results that we saw were actual body symmetry changes for the 33 people for whom we were able to get complete before and after hip abduction and external rotation measurements. There was a 45% improvement. And for the 53 people for whom we were able to get complete chest symmetry measurements, there was a 33% improvement. And we also had secondary measures as well that we looked at. Depth-width ratio of the chest was one. This really looks at how flattened the chest is, which of course has an effect on cardiopulmonary function. Pain, we saw actually a majority of the people beginning with moderate to severe pain, as measured by the pediatric pain profile, experienced decreased pain. And finally, 68% experienced improvement in their sleep quality, which was a pretty big deal, because a major criticism of trying to do therapeutic positioning when people are sleeping is that you're going to ruin their sleep. And it's not actually what we found at all in this pilot study. So moving on from that, what does 24 hours in a day really mean? Well, we've got a chunk of the day that a person is typically going to be in wheelchair seating. We've got pieces of equipment that are used for various kinds of specific activities. It could be standing frames, gait trainers, bathroom equipment, bikes, all those activity-specific pieces. We've got a chunk of time that's positions of rest, which may be in a recliner, a couch, floor mat, some kind of informal thing according to the person's preference and what's available. And then we've got supported lying, positioning for rest and sleep. And so these chunks of time around this circle are going to vary from person to person. It's not like it's going to be divided up into even quarters, which is sort of what the image makes this look like. But it's actually going to vary. So you may have people who are spending 8 or 10 hours a day in their wheelchair. They may be spending an hour and a half every day in their standing frame. You know, some people spend an hour and a half a day in their bathroom equipment. And yet some of these other people may be spending 10 or 12 hours or even more time than that in supported lying in rest and sleep positions. So this is all going to be very unique according to the individual. So if we've got these 24 hours per day, we really need to look at all three human orientations. And I always say that lying is the first and foundational because it is the first thing that we do when we are born. When we're born, we really can't do anything else unless our caregivers are providing support for us. And then if we are typically developing and things all go according to plans and hopes, we're going to progress through our developmental milestones and be able to achieve sitting and eventually, ideally, achieve standing. Although we know that many of the folks that are in the population that we all work with may not achieve that ability to stand independently, and they're going to end up using supportive equipment very often, both for sitting and for standing. So just really quickly, looking at the postures of these two girls, the first image was of my little girl, Eleanor, when she was just coming on to about 5 years old. And you can see what's going on with her pelvic obliquity, her unlevel shoulders. She's clearly off midline orientation, chin and head forward, posterior pelvic tilt, really working very hard to be able to sit in that non-supportive chair, which actually was what it was because we were camping at the time. I promise you that her wheelchair and all of her other equipment was much better than that. But I'm just for the purpose of analyzing the postures, take a look at her and then at Baunya right next to her, where her pelvis and her shoulders are pretty much level with each other. She's got good midline orientation. She's stable and she can look around and participate in her world. Here we've got another images of somebody standing. We've got Baunya in her standing frame over on the right side, and you can see that she's pretty well aligned, not perfect, but pretty well aligned. She had some pretty extensive postural support needs, but our little guy on the left is really off balance and obviously functional with and able to use his walker and to ambulate functionally. But you can see that his posture is not unlike what we often see in kids while they're standing and not actively moving, or even when they are actively moving sometimes. Way off midline orientation, there's pelvic obliquity going on. You can see his correcting his head to be able to have a level field of vision. And I would just say that when I look at a picture like this, when I see people using this kind of walking equipment, I say, yay, that they are ambulatory and they're able to be functional. But I think we really need to think about what may be happening to their bodies, to their soft tissue, to their joints, the stresses and strains on their bodies, and the toll that that might take over months and years of time. And in my world, the way then to address that would be, how is he sleeping at night? How is he resting when he gets home from school? Does he have some support so when he's sitting and doing activities, he's able to be in better balance? I would be looking at all these things with an aim, excuse me, to preserving his body for the future. And finally, looking at postures in line. This was my client, Dominic. I asked him to lie on the mat table just in the normal way that he would be comfortable, and this was what he did. And you can see there's quite a pelvic obliquity and rotation going on there. His hips and his knees are tight. And so when you can't straighten your legs out all the way, we'll be talking about this a little bit more in a minute. But when you can't straighten your legs out all the way, they're going to have to go someplace. And his fell to the side in a windswept posture. But we don't need to stay stuck that way. So this next picture is an image that I took of Dominic sometime later when I did a home visit, and just using materials that they had in their home, basically pillows and rolled up towels that I placed very specifically and intentionally beneath the fitted sheet. We were able to bring him into really nice midline orientation and symmetry by accommodating the tightness in his knees and hips. And also realizing that as long as we put something soft beneath his knees, we're not going to be contributing to continued knee flexion contractures. He did have a standing frame as well, so that was a really good way that he was getting a prolonged stretch for his knees. But also what we found is that just the gentle stretch of gravity by sleeping this way all night long is enough to help with straightening out the knees as well. So these images are just showing all these different orientations, including quadruped in this one. For a client of mine, you can see exactly what's going on with his posture and how those same postural tendencies are seen, whether he's lying in quadruped, sitting, or standing. So who's going to benefit from 24-hour posture care management? I believe that it's people who have a limited movement repertoire, and in a minute I'll show you exactly what I mean by that, and who are unable to easily change position independently. Because these people, in my experience, almost certainly will develop contractures and distortions, and they may be more severe, they may be less severe, it may take longer, it may be a shorter time before you see them. But I don't think many people get out of this situation with limited movement and difficulty changing position without developing some contractures and distortions. And this is going to be many, if not most, wheelchair users. So a limited movement repertoire. I'm going to show these images from a little girl that I met and worked with in Peru some years ago. She was, sorry about that. She was waiting for a while to have her wheelchair customized for her. She was about 3 years old, had never had a chair before. So she was lying on a mat table and sort of napping, resting. And I was able to be nearby and take images, pictures of her over a prolonged period of time and watch what her movements were as she was resting. And as you can see from this series of pictures, there's a very clear predominant orientation here of her turning toward her left. And on the lower left image, I almost thought for a minute, oh, maybe she will turn over toward her other side. Maybe she will orient toward her right. But no, she immediately went back to orienting toward her left. So this is what I mean when I say a limited movement repertoire. I've worked with numerous people over the years who've said, oh, my child or my person moves around a lot, you know, when they're lying down. It's not a big issue. It's not like they can't move. And my next question is always, tell me how they move, or do you know how they move? I've asked people to actually take a series of pictures like this of their person, who they say is moving all the time, because I think it can be really instructive in letting us see that while a person may be moving, they are always moving in the same orientation and resting in the same orientation. And that's where we run into problems, which you can actually see in this little girl when you compare her lying orientation and look at some of the very subtle manifestations. Excuse the crying face. She was really tired because it had been a long day. And this was the first time that she'd had a wheelchair. But if you look really closely, I'm going to use my cursor to show you what I'm talking about. Look at the orientation in her lower body, and especially her left leg. You can see already that there is a little abduction and external rotation happening there relative to her right leg. That very much goes along with the pattern of what we see in her lying posture. So at age 3, this is already showing up after 3 years of most likely tending to have this same orientation since she was really, really little, and spending lots and lots of time in it, because until this day, she had never had any opportunities to have any kind of positioning equipment. So what do you think? In order to prevent, correct, and even improve altered body shapes, is good seating support really going to be enough? And is adding a good standing frame enough? That's what I would like for all of you to be thinking about. So when we're talking about 24-hour posture care management, PCM is what I say for short. We really need to understand not just what is happening today, but we need to be able to have a bit of a crystal ball and be able to understand what is likely to happen to the body in the future. Obviously, we're paying careful attention to posture in all activities, and we're analyzing the linkage between lying, sitting, and standing positions, which is what we just finished doing. And we must use a team approach, because any sort of therapeutic positioning program, if you're going to try and carry it out throughout the 24-hour period, you're going to need to have buy-in and understanding and commitment from all members of the team, including family members and caregivers. So how do distorted body shapes occur? Noreen Hare is a physiotherapist who lived in the UK, but also worked in Canada and in India with people with all kinds of neurological conditions for many years. And she did a lot of work with postural stability, and she coined the term the human sandwich. It was her way of describing, and I think it's a very good way of describing, the action of gravity on the human body resting or sitting or even standing on a support surface. So this is basically what all of us are experiencing all the time. We are all supported by whatever surface that we are sitting or standing or lying on, and gravity is always moving toward the center of the earth, having an impact on us. And you can see here with my former client how gravity had literally flattened his body against the support surface. So in the left image, he is as prone as he was able to get. In the right image, he was as supine as he was able to get. But you can see the mirror image of his posture, that whether he's on his stomach or on his back, basically his body has shaped this, has become the same shape, a sort of a C shape, because soft tissue and skeletal changes have taken place over time. And what is the impact when we see these sorts of distortions? This was one of my clients whose mother was kind enough to share his X-ray image prior to his spinal fusion surgery. And I think it's really helpful to be able to see what a person looks like on the outside and at the inside at the same time, to be able to begin to see what's happening in terms of the shifting of internal organs into places where they're not really intended to be, and how that might be impacting function. So asymmetry, gravity, and time are going to tend to have their action. They certainly do in babies, where we've seen a great increase in positional plagiocephaly since the Back to Sleep campaign began in the 1990s. It really largely, in major ways, improved the SIDS death rate, but we saw a really big increase in torticollis and positional plagiocephaly at the same time. And Kawakami et al. In this reference have actually been able to look at and correlate asymmetrical skull deformity in kids with CP together with other postural abnormalities like windswept postures and scoliosis. So we're really talking about something that it's almost like you could call it a syndrome, although it's not really a syndrome, but it's a pattern that you see. You don't just see these distortions in isolation. You see them all fitting together. So in this image, you can see our little girl on the left in her ATNR, which is perfectly normal and typical for her at her age. You know, in a minute, she's going to shift into some other different posture. But you look at Ken on the right, and see how over time for him growing up in an institution, basically just having his body go where it was going to go habitually, he reached a point where his body really did not bounce back and he can't shift because his body has been flattened like a human sandwich. This is a boy that I worked with in the Middle East some years ago. Again, he was 17 in this picture. You can see his obligatory asymmetric lying posture that he had spent most of his life in, really, because he'd had no access to therapy or any kind of positioning equipment. And when you look at the second image, you can see his mother is pointing to what really concerned her, of course, rightfully, that his rib cage and his pelvis were touching each other. But you can actually see the overstretching that has taken place in the upper part in the first image, and then the shortening of soft tissues and the skeletal changes that have taken place as he has been flattened like a human sandwich against the support surface. So leg posture in lying is a really big thing because there's a domino effect. Our legs are 35% or so of our body weight. It can be even a little bit more for children. And so when they cannot straighten, legs are going to fall, either knees together, knees out to the side, or both knees to one side in a windswept posture. But especially when they end up going to the side in a windswept position, they are also, because they weigh so much, dragging our pelvis over. They're impacting the shape of our rib cage and our spine. There's just more than 1/3 of our body weight is inevitably going to have an effect on our pelvis and on our upper body as well. So these positions are going to put hips at risk of dislocation. And why would that be? Well, largely because if you're spending lots and lots of time in these kinds of positions, one of them, or typically it would be one that an individual would be in predominantly, over time, especially if you've already got perhaps a fairly shallow acetabulum, if you haven't had all the opportunities for weight bearing to really develop a good solid hip socket, your ligaments that are holding the head of the femur into place in the acetabulum are really going to be at risk for overstretching. And as they stretch and stretch and stretch over time, you're going to be more and more at risk for subluxation or dislocation. And these are just some of the images that I've taken, or that my clients' parents have taken and sent to me, of the way that their kids were sleeping in bed. So what can we do for hips? I usually recommend relaxed aligned positioning. Here you can see the before and after picture for this little girl that we worked with in Peru. This is really going to vary for individuals, and it has to be looked at very, very carefully in terms of what comfortable range a person has. Certainly you're not going to take them to end range. When I say 15 to 30 degrees hip abduction here, that's just kind of a general thing. I don't say any sort of specific degrees because it has to be so individual. But that is just kind of extrapolated out from what people talk about in the literature about standing. But you can see this, you can't see her head in the first image, but I can tell you that we tried to engage this little girl with a toy while she was lying in her habitual posture at the beginning. And she was not interested, wouldn't play with it or anything. And once we provided external support for her in supine, her hand was on that toy and she was going for it. Quickly, just a visual case study for Andrew. January 2017, you can see how he was in a corrected supine lying posture. You can see the improvement that we saw just a mere 9 months later. And 1 year later, again, you can see the improvement. I've got the numbers, although I can't share those with you today because we don't have time. What did he do? These are two images. The first is the picture that his mother sent me when she applied for him to be part of the Montana Postural Care Project. And the second one is him sleeping in his informal sleep system. And this was all that he did in order to be able to get this kind of result. which actually preserved his ability to do stand pivot transfers, which was a really big thing for him as a high schooler. So I'm just going to ask you at this point, if you have any questions about this section, just jot them down and save them till the end. But it's good sometimes to kind of break things up and just think about if there's anything specific that has come to you as we've gone over this specific part. Now, what can happen to the chest and spine? Our chests are so flexible, we don't even realize how flexible they are. And so I have this image I like to share of this little boy I met in Peru who had spent long extended periods of time in his preferred posture on his left side with his tight little arm against his rib cage. And as he had grown, he'd actually developed a sort of a divot in his rib cage where his arm rested all the time. Something you don't see very often, but it does happen. So when we are acted upon by gravity in the human sandwich sort of scenario, compression flattens the chest. And you can see in these two images, the difference between the upper one, which is a more typical rounded shaped human chest, and a more flattened one below, where you're actually compressing the space between the sternum and the spinal column. It's an imaginary line called the sternal-spinal line. There's compression of that space, which is, of course, going to affect cardiopulmonary function. But when people are lying in an orientation more toward one side than toward the other, as, for example, the little girl in pink was demonstrating for us, things get really complicated because that sternum is moving more toward one side than to the other. Once it's on the diagonal, then gravity is going to tend to push it more and more and more so that it will actually become more extreme. I don't know if you can see my image right now, but I'm trying to demonstrate for you what gravity is going to do with that tilted sternal-spinal line. It's going to tend to flatten and increase the distortion such that we really end up with a longer distance on the side away from which the person is turning and a shorter distance toward the direction that the person is turning. And this is where we start to see the rib flares, the posterior prominences that we see in people who are developing scoliosis over time. So rotation can look like this, all kinds of different images, probably as many images as there are people. They're very, very unique. But I like to draw attention especially to the prone rotated image on the right, which is perhaps the most destructive of all of the potentials, because when you're lying prone, there is no way that you can avoid being rotated and still be able to breathe. If you've got tight hips and knees like this young man did, they are going to be forced into either abduction, I've seen that, or they're going to be forced into a windswept posture. So things start to get even more complicated with people who are prone sleepers. And that rotation can lead to this. This is, I was just mentioning to you about the difference in measurements between right and left sides. This boy had a 45-degree scoliosis at the time I measured him, a 45-degree Cobb angle. And you can see that he had a 2-centimeter difference between his right and his left sides. So what can be done with the chest and spine? Mary was a participant in the Montana Postural Care Project. This is an image showing her the way that she slept at night. Notice her TLSO up above her head because she didn't sleep well with it, so she never slept in it. Although she was supposed to be wearing it 23 hours a day, she just couldn't tolerate it while she slept. And the second image was Mary in her corrected supine posture, as straight as we could help her be. So what did we do? She used an informal sleep system, and the real focus was on moving her sternum toward the middle, so that no longer was her sternum migrating toward the left as it is in the second picture. And we were able to improve her midline orientation, as you can see. And here are some pictures over 3 succeeding years of the changes in terms of her midline orientation and symmetry and balance in lying. So again, I would ask you to just jot down any questions that you have after this section, and we will get to them shortly at the end. So what can we use and where do we start, especially when funds are limited? This is a big question for many people. Best practice in complex rehab technology is always going to include a MAT evaluation. Typically, MAT evaluations focus on range of movement and posture for sitting. A supine portion is always part of that evaluation. And my contention is that by lingering just a few extra minutes to focus on lying posture rather than moving right on through it, we can improve our success both in sitting posture and in standing posture with the equipment that we are prescribing for people in those orientations. So I try to encourage this because I've heard many people say, oh, I just don't have time to do one more thing. But if you are in a situation where you're doing MAT evaluations already, really, I've been in that situation for years, add 3, 4, 5 minutes to take some pictures of the person in their lying posture, both from above and from the side, both in their corrected posture and their uncorrected posture. That's going to give you a lot of information together with knowing how corrected they can be so that you can start helping them develop a plan for postural support in lying. So whether you're using formal or improvised equipment, the supports go under the sheet. This happens to be a SymetraSleep system, so you can see what it looks like. Supports beneath the sheet always work better because they're going to stay in place better. This was one of my clients who had a SymetraSleep, and you can see how we were able to improve his symmetry and midline orientation with the supports placed beneath the sheet. But I have to be honest with you, and I have to tell you that the vast majority of work I've done in this area has been using other kinds of supports because I lived in a less resourced state for more than 38 years where there was no funding for formal sleep systems or nighttime support, lying support systems. So I became very adept both in Montana and in the work that I'm involved in Peru at using other kinds of things, making things, using everyday supports. These are a couple of images. The first one in Montana, the second one in Peru, of creative ways of using stuffed animals in a therapeutic manner. We've used pool noodles and towels and cupboard liner, sandwiching supports between 2 layers of cupboard liner or rug liner, and having all of this beneath a fitted sheet is really a good way to secure things in place. And here you can see the improvement in the lying posture for this young lady who had Rett syndrome. Here's my colleague Elizabeth in Peru demonstrating her method of using roll towels and sheets and some rug liner to be able to improve the lying support for Emily. This little girl actually wins the prize for the prettiest lying support system. Her mother is actually a beautiful seamstress, and she made her sleep system using sandbags for her lateral trunk supports and little Velcro straps that can be grown as the child grows. Her OT had carved the lower body support, and then the mother tailored a cover to fit it. And here is another mama-created sleep system in Peru, empty water bottles filled with sand, covered with fabric, again, Velcro straps, a custom carved pillow to help this child's head remain midline oriented rather than always turning to one side. So I like to show these, and this is a PVC pipe frame to hold covers up off of one of my Montana clients' feet as she's sleeping in her sleep system. I like to show these hopefully to get some creative juice flowing so that people realize that even if you are trying to get some funding for a formal sleep system and it's taking you a while to get approval or to raise money, there are still things you can do to start helping people right away if they need this intervention. Now we're quickly going to go through a couple of case studies, so we'll have a little time for questions. This is a case study that I just got published this year. You've already seen Baunya in a couple of earlier pictures. And these were Baunya's numbers. When I began taking data, I got 6 years of data on Baunya. Her depth width ratio was 1.01, which you can actually see in the picture how narrow she is at her axilla compared to the width of her pelvis. It means that she was very flattened side to side, because for 11 years, she always slept on her side, being turned from side to side every 2 hours by her mother. And you can imagine neither one of them really got all that much sleep doing that. You can see also that she had rotation going. You can see pretty clearly that her orientation is toward her right. And so she has about a 2 centimeter difference shorter on her right than on her left, as I was talking about before. So this is a manner of measurement, that you can use even informally. I used a very formalized method called the Goldsmith indices to get these measurements with a special instrument. But clinically, you can even just work out something a little bit less formal to try and monitor how somebody is doing. This is her mother. Positioning Baunya at night. And what we did was derotated again her chest, as we did with Mary. So her sternum tended to always go toward her right. So she was derotated to bring her sternum into the middle of her chest. And over 6 years' time, this is the data that we saw. Her depth width ratio change, which was kind of off the charts, if we're looking at these 2 lines as being the typical range, fell down into the normal range in less than a year, and maintained in that near or in that typical range for the next 5 years, until the last time she was measured. Her right-left ratio change also reached a point where over time, as we were trying to get her chest more rounded, we weren't paying quite so much attention to her chest rotation, saw that she dropped, was actually becoming worse. We changed the intervention to add a different level of support. She immediately bounced up. And by the time she was almost 18 years old, she was 11 at the beginning, she actually had gotten back up to where she was at age 11 without any surgery. Her scoliosis actually improved going through puberty. So we were pretty excited about that benefit for her. And you can read this on your slides. I'd also like you to meet Jim. Jim was able-bodied for most of his life until he was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. And by the time he was referred to me, it was because of his chronic pain in his neck and shoulder and his headaches. He was having a lot of behaviors and asking for pain meds every night, couldn't sleep. And so I asked him to assume his usual lying posture. He showed me how he usually fell asleep at night, and I asked him to try and straighten himself out, and he did the best that he could. And so this was what I mocked up in my office. And his caregivers took pictures and said that they would go home and in the group home where he lives, start trying to implement similar kind of positioning for him while he was sleeping at night. And that's exactly what they did. They sent me pictures from home of him being unsupported and then moving into the supported posture that they created for him, just using stuff that they had at home. And when he came back to see me 2 months later, his caregivers reported he was no longer taking or asking for pain meds at night. He wasn't complaining as much in the daytime, and he was sleeping better. And several months later, he was sleeping well. His headache, neck, shoulder pain were gone, and he was sitting better in his chair and on the mat. And by the way, that January visit, we had not even done anything with his wheelchair at all. That was when we did a shape capture for a new seating system. And so when he came to see us in April, that was when he actually got his new seating system. But by then he was already sleeping well and had when his pain was being managed well. So the benefits for Jim, obviously, sleeping well, less pain, more stable sitting posture, and less need for medication. So real quickly, here's a testimonial from another former client of mine in Montana, Abby. Just some images of what she is using when she sleeps at night. Abby's a very independent young woman, as you can tell. She uses an ultralight wheelchair and very active. Here's a second image of her in a therapy session. And she gets herself in and out of her positioning supports for sleeping every night, all by herself without any assistance. And these are some of her words about postural care. Again, I'm not going to read these to you because you can read them in your slides. But these are actual verbatim statements. She texted them to me and gave me permission to use them. So these are direct quotes from Abby. She feels very strongly that she would like to be able to help spread the word about how helpful this has been for her. And if you would like to actually hear more from her, I have a couple of links on my website, www.posture247.org. And there is a little instructional testimonial video there with Abby talking about her experience. And in another area, there's a link to a Zoom call where she was a special guest this past winter and shared some of her story and answered questions from clinicians about her experience. So at this point, I think we can answer some questions. I think I've left enough time. I hope I have. And I always do like to say thank you to the many clients and families who taught me so much, as well as to my daughter. And I'd be happy to answer questions if there are any.
We do have a few questions. First one I have is, I have a question about the skin integrity of sleeping in the same position all night.
Wonderful. I'm so glad somebody asked that because it's an important thing to consider. You know, because of limits in time today, I couldn't include everything that I would really like to include. But I do have pressure mapping images demonstrating how the addition of postural supports in lying can actually improve and remove scary, excessive pressure. The same person, same mattress, with and without lying supports. It's quite remarkable. The reason is that when you're lying supine and when you're using postural supports, you're really distributing body weight and pressure over a much, much larger portion of your body compared to when you don't have supports. And the way I like to describe this is in wheelchair seating, we don't want to have fabrics, for example, in a seat cushion. We don't want the fabric to have a hammocking effect because we want people to sink down and really be positioned on the cushion, right? But I look at it differently when we're talking about postural supports and lying. We're actually using that hammocking effect. First of all, we're using it to derotate the chest and bring the sternum into the middle just by doing a very subtle shift. Same thing with leveling the pelvis so that the pelvis is level as the person is lying. But also that hammocking effect with having the supports beneath the fitted sheet actually means even better pressure distribution throughout the whole body. So I would be happy to share a slide or two. I can't right now, but if somebody wanted me to email it to them, you could just email it to me, or email me at this address, and I could share a couple of slides to let you see what it is that I'm talking about. During the time that I've been doing this, obviously we're really, really careful with people, often use pressure mapping when we're setting people up, do skin checks. I often recommend that people first try it out, say for a rest period or a nap in the afternoon. But I can say that of all the people that I've worked with, we've not seen anybody develop any pressure injuries, and that has been a worry for many people. I hope that helps.
It does. I'm actually going to go to a related question. Does this mean that supine lying is the preferred position for sleeping? My 9-year-old daughter, who is ambulatory with a walker, likes to sleep on her side. She recently had VRDO surgery.
Yes, I would say that supine is the preferred sleeping position. And the reason for that, and I hope I made it clear enough in the presentation, is that it's very difficult to avoid rotation when you're lying on your side. If you just think about it, trying to lie exactly on your side, you're always going to have your upper arm and your upper leg that are going to want to go someplace. So unless you very carefully have anterior and posterior supports at the trunk and at the pelvis, and you really, really support that upper leg and that upper arm, inevitably they're going to fall backwards or fall forwards, and that's going to introduce rotation, which is where you get into more of the complex problems. The other thing is it's also your bony prominences are much more difficult to manage. You tend to have your arms fall asleep, legs fall asleep. You just can't distribute the pressure as well when people are side lying.
The next question, any great ideas on how to get families to buy into these ideas? I'm struggling with this all the time.
And that is it's an ongoing struggle. You know, I'm a real advocate of sharing as much information absolutely as possible. As I mentioned in the Montana Postural Care Project, we did group trainings with professionals and families and caregivers, everybody together. It was a continuing education course approved through the University of Pittsburgh to motivate therapists to come so that they could get their CEUs for free. But we found that people really, really learned from each other. And whereas therapists looked at the information and thought about all the folks they were working with, families looked at the information and they were just thinking about their one person and applying it to their one person. There are some materials on my website that we have tried to create. I had a wonderful OT student working on her doctorate with me a couple of years ago who developed some PDFs and some instructional videos. Most of the PDFs are for users and caregivers as well as clinicians, as are the videos. I also have my friend Trish Toole also started a it's called Intro to 24-Hour Postural Care private Facebook group on Facebook. I've referred many families there, and also people like group home managers, for example. She's developed a series of 7 10-minute videos, and she does some of them actually with her own young adult son who has CP. And she is an OT and a seating therapist as well. And that private Facebook group was specifically designed for families and caregivers, although therapists are very welcome to join. Feel free. I was one of the first people who joined. So that's another good resource that you could share with families. You know, feel free if you want to, use the PDFs for my presentation to show them some of the images to illustrate what can actually happen. It's not that I'm trying to shock people, but I think that many, many, many people have no idea what the stakes are and what could actually happen to their child as they enter pre-adolescence and adolescence. And we all know that the vast majority of kids are born with beautiful symmetrical little bodies, and then we start losing them as they grow and go through growth spurts. So if these images and the PDF of my presentation could be helpful, go for it.
Thanks. The next question is, what about the head neck orientation on the last little girl? isn't that part of the alignment concern? And I think she's referring to Mary.
Oh, to Mary. Mary had a tracheostomy. And so that made a little bit of a difference. She slept with a ventilator at night. And so I think maybe this person is talking about the fact that she looked a little bit hyperextended, potentially. She did also tend to turn her head to one side. And what we did there, you couldn't really see it in the slide unless I drew your attention to it, and I didn't. But we actually supported and tucked extra things. That was a rolled up towel or something that we put underneath her pillow to raise one side of her pillow to nudge her more toward midline position with her neck. But in terms of a little bit of hyperextension, we didn't mess with that much because of her trach and her vent. I hope that answered the question.
It makes sense. The next question, do you address the feet and ankles?
Yes, we do. We address everything. But I will say that the first things that I really address, to me, the upper body is the life and death part. That's where we're going to have increased risk of pneumonia, cardiopulmonary function, restrictive lung disease. And so while I look at everything and advocate addressing everything, my first focus is always at trying to protect and improve that chest shape, because that is what's going to make and break it for so many people health-wise. And not that the other parts aren't important, they absolutely are. But in my long career, I've had the experience of having a number of my clients die of restrictive lung disease, who had severe scoliosis and chest flattening. And so I take that pretty seriously and make that a priority. But you could see, like in the little girl in Peru, for example, the custom support that her therapist had made for her. So yes, we do look at feet.
Well, it makes sense for the chest cavity because that's one of the leading causes of mortality for
Right.
children and adults with CP.
Right.
The next question is, do you wait until a certain age to begin making modifications to infant sleeping surfaces?
I start as soon as possible. I'm aware of the American Academy of Pediatrics recommendations about flat sleeping surfaces with nothing in the bed. And obviously, I'm not trying to advocate for something that is going to put people in a situation of liability. But I think there are times when we really have to use our clinical judgment about whether it's going to be safer and more beneficial for a person to be in a habitual, asymmetrical, potentially destructive posture over time on a flat surface, or whether they are going to be safer and in the future healthier if they are given some carefully placed supports beneath the fitted sheet just to help them where they need help. I find it really interesting that positioning is used for babies in the NICU, premature babies in the NICU. And we recognize that that is needed for those babies developmentally. And yet there isn't really very much talk at all about what to do when those babies go home. Now, if a baby is typically developing and we're not seeing any atypical neurological signs or movement impairments or whatever, that's one thing. But one of my concerns is that as wonderful as the whole Safe to Sleep campaign is, and as important as those concepts are, I think they are really, really aimed at typically developing babies who are going through their milestones and who are not being stuck in one potentially destructive position. And I think we need to be really careful. I think we need to use our clinical judgment and thoroughly educate families. But I would say that the earlier you can start with positioning in the lying posture to help a child, and here I'm really going to emphasize, to help a child develop the ability to be in a balanced, symmetrical lying posture when they're not able to develop that ability on their own, the better off that child is going to be.
Okay, how do you implement 24/7 sleeping systems when not hired by group homes? I have a student that went from 45-degree to 90-degree curvature scoliosis while he stayed at home during COVID.
Oh my gosh. This was in I assume this was in a home family situation.
I'm
What,
not sure,
yeah.
Joanna, was the client at home or were they in a group home? Nope, a group home.
A group home. You know, during COVID, I did things by Zoom. I would do Zoom calls, basically telehealth Zoom calls. During COVID was the time when I really referred, because I couldn't really do any in-person training myself. I referred some of my group home people to that private Facebook group that I already told you about, so that they could learn some of the concepts and start to implement them. And then I would meet with them by Zoom, and we would work it out together with them in person with the client and me just working with them through the camera. That's heartbreaking, what you just shared about 45 degrees to 90, because well, it's just heartbreaking. And I know that those things happen. And it's why I'm trying as much as possible to get the word out about the importance of positioning in all the human orientations to as many people as possible.
Joanna, I'm also assuming from your post that you work either in the day program and are not employed by the group home, so you're not allowed into the group home. But if you could get it into his ISP or his, whatever they call him, his program, so that you could get buy into the group home. I know it's hard when you're the outside therapist working with a group home, it's difficult. And feel free to either email Tamara or myself and we can help you work it out.
Yeah, I'd be happy to discuss that with you. I worked in group homes in Missoula, Montana for many years, and I was never employed by the group homes. I was either employed by a state funded program and then they let me in, or else I was in the last 10, 15 years, I was an independent contractor. And I did wheelchair clinics for them and all the positioning and mobility equipment for the people in the group homes, and they let me into the group homes in that kind of capacity. But I'd be happy to help you problem solve, because I feel pretty passionate about that population. I have a friend who coined the term being a foot soldier for that population, and I didn't come up with that term, but I would like to use it as well, because I think that they are an oft forgotten group of people.
Yeah, Joanna writes, she's not allowed in the group home. I work in the school system that he attends, MCBDD. Yeah, it's hard to try to get things into the ISP so that the group home has to follow them. But email and we can talk offline. Are there any other questions? You're welcome, Joanne.
Doesn't look like we have any more questions. So I just want to thank everyone from Ultimate Medical for your attendance in today's webinar. The link to the course slides is in the chat. I will post that link one more time with the PDF. And just a reminder again for the privacy of those in the presentation, if you downloaded the PowerPoint version of this presentation, please delete it, and you can re-download it in the link that I will post as a PDF. Again, we ask you to do that for the privacy of those included in the presentation. Obtaining your CEU for attending this course should be easy. To receive your CEU credit, you'll have to complete the survey at the end of this webinar. The survey should automatically populate in your web browser after you exit the webinar. If it doesn't automatically populate, don't worry. The link will be available in the follow-up email you will receive from Zoom in 24 hours. If you don't receive a follow-up email from Zoom, please check your spam folder. This course will be available on demand soon, along with Ultimate Medical's entire catalog of on-demand CEU accredited courses. If you or someone you know is in need of some more free CEUs available on your own time, please check out ultimatemedical.com/education. And just a few more things. We do have a podcast. If you're interested in our podcast, it's Positioning 365 Beyond Seating, available on streaming platforms Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Marianne sits down and has covered some very interesting topics, including neuromuscular hip dysplasia and 24-hour postural care management, if you want to hear them discuss more about the topic that we covered today. Again, thank you for your time and attendance this morning for our webinar. We hope you enjoyed it and hope to see you again soon. If you have any questions after the conclusion of the webinar, please email us at education@ultimatemedical.com. Thank you.
Thank you, Tamara.
Thank you. Take care.
Take care.